to sort of combine that with the reason why I wanted to have you on, my recommendation for you was Jean Dielman, and I wish I had written down the name of the cinematographer for that movie, but that was a case of very, very beautiful and purposeful cinematography. Very simplistic, but it also like very, very impressive. And the one thing that kind of impresses me is that when I was doing, and we can touch on this aspect more, but when I was reading about it after I saw the movie, is that it had an 80% female crew in a time where that just didn't happen. It was like mid-1970s. So I think that's impressive looking back on it, but it's almost kind of strange looking back on it because that's almost kind of a big deal still today.
It definitely
is. So what is your take on the state of representation for women in the film industry now versus what it was like back then?
So, I mean, I did read up on that as well. I saw that, I mean, of course, when you recommended that movie to me, you did mention that, it was a female director, incredibly talented one at that.
Mm-hmm.
I had done some research after I finished the movie, and I'd seen that it was a mostly female crew, and it was a big deal to me, even being a woman. And you're right, it's a little bit sad that it's a big deal now. In what that movie was 1975,
75,
I believe,
yeah,
and it's 2020 now, and that's still a big deal. And it's definitely more common now to have. I want to say just generally more females on a crew, but I will say that in all of the projects I've worked on, there's definitely a much larger number of males on the set than females, and I believe we touched on that at the panel that you had attended with me and Celine.
Yeah.
And it's kind of even, just in film school in general, there's definitely still more males. I would 100% say it's still a male-dominated industry.
Why do you think that is? Because I think, like, when I look at other jobs and other walks of life, it's not always 100% even, but it is, for the most part, like, around, like, a 50-50 or a 60-40 split. But you have, like, in this industry especially, like, there's so many, like, people could go on and on and on about all the directors they like, but then you ask them to name like 5 female directors, and I think most like, even now, like, I watch so many movies and I can remember so many directors' names, but I'm hard pressed to come up with like 3 or 4. So, like, why do you think that is? That because I don't think it's a stretch to say that there. Let me rephrase that. I don't think that it's kind of ridiculous to say that, like, there are more men in it versus, like, the small amount of women. I think it is a much closer split, but we just don't hear about those women.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. You're right. That's a great point. You're right. I wouldn't say that it's male dominated. I would say that it looks male dominated. And I hate to say this, but this has absolutely always been the case. And again, I believe I touched on this at that panel as well, that women have always been considered the bossy people on a set. And unfortunately, you and I, working in an industry that you can get blacklisted so easily, word travels fast. And I'm in a class right now where we're discussing how to brand yourself and, working on resumes, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a communication design class, so technically a film major isn't, like, normally in the class.
It's close.
Yeah, but for that kind of thing, when we were writing our cover letters and everything, you had to write to someone specific. I had to go to the professor, and I was kind of like, in this industry, you don't usually, like, apply to be an assistant director.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of, like, word travels. You get recommendations. I get people coming up to me and saying, like, I recommended you to this person, and that's great, but when it comes down to it, I think that has a lot to do with, people going and saying, oh, she said this to me on set, it's just because she's a woman.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's happened to me many times on a set as well, because, I mean, when you're an assistant director especially, like, you have you have that driving force,
mm-hmm.
and, things have to get done. So if I have to yell at someone, I'll yell at someone, and that doesn't always get taken well. And you know, it's a tough split for me to figure out if it's worth it for me to kind of give up what I believe in to continue to have a job.
Right.
It's tough to be like, okay, well, I have to be, should I be acting like the nice person, the nice, sweet person that everyone wants me to be acting like, just so I can continue to have a job? Or should I be sticking to my morals and also sticking to my skill set?
Mm-hmm.
And I found that personally, you know, I get a lot of respect from people, I feel like, from sticking to my skill set, because it gets the job done, it gets the film done. And acting the way that maybe they would prefer I act just doesn't get that done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that ends up being a huge issue on, you know, even on small sets, on big sets, it doesn't matter. When it comes down to women working on it, no matter what the position is, if it always has seemed like if they're not acting submissive, then they don't have a job in the future. And it's horrible, really.
Yeah, it definitely is. I didn't even I kind of had some idea of it, but the point you touched on there is like, if you have a bossy male director, like that's just that's what a director is. But it's like you said, if women just aren't looked at in the same lens of like equal power as a male director, and that you're right, it does oftentimes result in like, oh, don't work with them, like it's so much of a headache. But you don't even like with someone like Kubrick, for instance, like he famously for The Shining was very, very harsh on like Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson. Shelley Duvall especially, to like deliver such a specific performance to like the point of emotional and mental abuse. But if like, let's say, I can't like think of an example, but like let's say that if he was a woman trying to get away with that, like there's no way he would have been fired instantly. So why do you think that is? Like, why, and this is kind of even like from a broader perspective, like almost like getting into the societal difference of why is it this way? Why do you think that there is that difference inherently?
I mean, that's definitely kind of it's a broader, not just based in film kind of thing, where, you know, it's just that I guess men have always kind of just been looked at as that power figure that gets to have the last say, really. When it comes down to it, I've worked with male directors or even people who were working under me that will 100% undermine what I'm saying. And, you know, I mean, I'm just saying, but when you're the assistant director, it might not be the best thing to mess with the assistant director, because they're generally in charge of pretty much everything that they could possibly be in charge of. So I just think it comes down to people continue to follow that men have always been the domineering, like, center of the family kind of thing, and without them, people seem to think that you know, a woman couldn't do the same job. And I honestly can't say why that is. It's, when it comes down to it, I think that it's still so apparent in 2020 because of the mob mentality. And there are still people today, still men in the bigger grand scheme of thing industry, who definitely aren't going to give that up anytime soon. And, you know, that comes into play with the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein. And there's just so many men in power that believe that they can do whatever they want to a woman or to whoever, and that there won't be a consequence. And it's just now starting in the last few years that those men are now getting their consequences.
Right.
And that's not to say that, you know, there's, of course, not everybody's like that. There's just definitely those people that worsen the situation.
It's just unfortunate that there's so many of them in that prominent role. Do you think that that's kind of like, I hate to say, one of the plus sides of the Me Too movement, but do you think that that's been like a positive aspect of that movement, where because we've become so focused on hearing women's awful experiences that we're now kind of retroactively like supporting them more? because of that? Like, I don't know if that makes sense what
No,
I'm
it
trying to
does.
say, but like,
Excuse me.
So do you think that that is like a direct correlation, or do you think that just is like two separate things that have kind of been happening concurrently?
No, I absolutely think that it does have to do with that. It definitely coincides. I mean, like I said, I had just watched Kill Bill recently because one of my best friends had never seen it. And when we went and put on part 2, I mean, my friend immediately went, oh, this is the part where Uma, like, got hurt, and
Right.
Harvey Weinstein didn't let her tell anyone for, like, what, 15 years?
Something like that, yeah.
And
didn't she have like permanent like damage to
back
her like
damage,
shoulder
yeah.
or something? Okay.
And she, I believe it was not long after the Me Too movement became so big, as she posted the footage on Instagram, on her Instagram page, and explained that, you know, she didn't talk to Quentin Tarantino for maybe, I want to say 8 years, because she felt at the time like she couldn't forgive him for that.
Right.
And ultimately it was Weinstein saying like that he refused to give her the tape, and that he didn't want her to go and even seek medical help because he didn't want to get in trouble for it. And while that's not a situation of the typical Me Too movement explanation, it still speaks volumes to me, and it still amazes me that that's what that scene's known for now. And while it's a grim reminder that happened, and it's unfortunate that happened to her, I'm glad that it's something that people are talking about now. Every time that scene gets brought up, whatever location I'm in, that story gets brought up as well. And it's definitely, it's how I said that it was the mob mentality. It's like a mob mentality fighting back now. I think it's definitely it's a good thing that it's, you know, being so open about those things now, because it kind of coincides with, you know, in the 70s or the 80s or something, a woman couldn't even, you know, talk about her body.
Right.
And it was pretty condemned. And now we're in a time period where that's changed, so we can start making strides toward change within smaller areas such as the film industry.
And I think it's a good thing that it's kind of started in such like a public industry. Like, I think movies, it's arguably the biggest industry in the entire world because it's so universal. Everything goes everywhere, and I think that it's definitely, regardless of whether there is like a direct correlation or not, I think it's definitely great that we're having that discussion now, and there's more thoughts on representation and including more people, not even just women, but just all sorts of walks of life, whether you're part of the LGBTQ, I don't remember the full acronym, but that community, or like we had mentioned earlier, bringing in more foreign language movies. But one thing that I wanted to discuss, and I talked about it with you a little bit on Instagram when we were setting this up, was you had shared a post where they were talking about the new, I don't even remember what it's called now because they changed the title, but
it was Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of a Harley Quinn.
Okay, so yeah, that new, and I, for the record, I will say I'm more of a Marvel versus DC fan, so if anyone's going to say that that's part of the argument, fine, whatever. But the point that you were trying to make was that you shared this image that it was an article that movie hadn't done financially that well its opening weekend, and someone shared that article saying that it was solely because of misogyny and how people are not going to see it because it's a movie about women in power. And the point that you had made was maybe it's just not a good movie. And I think that's like, it sounds kind of bad, I think, to say, because it has that, it definitely has that connotation of like inherently sounding like you're against progress. But I think it's important to recognize that while more inclusion and the fact that we are having so much more in the way of representation, it's a good thing overall. It's important to recognize that there can be movies that are just as flawed as everything else, and I think that it's kind of a toxic mentality to have, that just we should accept everything regardless of its quality.
I definitely, so I mean, you had mentioned to me that, you know, that was part of why you seeing that post was part of what we wanted to talk about tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually pretty excited to talk about that because since we had discussed it and since I'd made that post, you know, I've seen a few other things here and there. I had noticed that the movie has like pretty good reviews on Letterboxd and I think IMDb as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised because I mean I'll put it out there, I didn't like Suicide Squad very much at all.
Neither did I.
Like at all. And I had mentioned on that post that I'm a huge fan of Harley Quinn, and I'll be honest, I don't have a preference between DC and Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just me. But I had mentioned that I really appreciate Harley Quinn's character, so I was excited for Suicide Squad. I didn't hate the costume design, and that comes into play. Because I had seen quite a few people talking about how they hated her new costume for Birds of Prey, and I mean, I dabbled quite a bit in costume design when I was younger as well, and I definitely see what everyone has been saying about how you can definitely tell that the costume in Suicide Squad was definitely geared for like the male gaze.
Right.
Whereas,
even down to the framing. I think I know
yeah.
which one you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, where it's like the two comparative pictures. Yeah.
And then in, you know, this new movie, she's got a pretty wild outfit on. She cuts her hair off and everything, and I definitely agree that it looks like, knowing her character pretty well, it looks like something more like that she would wear.
Mm-hmm.
So I do definitely agree with that, and I thought a lot about it. I saw a lot of people discussing how they actually really liked the movie, and I also wrote on my post that I've not seen the movie, so it was just my opinion. It's just that when I had watched the trailer, I really wasn't excited for the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that they changed it quite a bit from when they had first had even talked about making the movie.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of just been the trend with DC movies in general, I feel like. Changing everything after they already have a plan.
But it was very interesting because seeing all of these women and men giving it good reviews, it made me kind of consider wanting to see it, but I don't know if I would see it in the box office.
Mm-hmm.
However, I still, at the moment, I do feel the same way, that I do kind of think that in this case, it really might not be a misogyny, it might be a bad movie, and it could also be both.
Right.
There's always that option that it could partly be that men are just saying that they don't like it. I'm not 100% sure where they were pulling that information from.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely a truth to it, just by the sheer virtue of the fact that comic book fans are kind of that vitriolic anyway. But
yeah.
I do think that that's definitely not the only reason why that movie didn't do well.
Yeah, and I mean, I had just not really been looking forward to it since the trailer came out, and I watched it, and I don't even think I could get through it, if we're being honest. But I do think it's important that you don't just assume every single time that there has to be a reason why this movie did badly. Like, of course there is, because sometimes, though, it could just be that the movie wasn't made well, the movie wasn't written well, kind of thing. But it is also important to understand when there is a reason, and when this movie may have actually failed because of misogyny, or because of something else. But like I said, in this situation, I really think that this movie might have just been bad. But again, I haven't seen it, so...
Well, neither. I don't have any plans to see it just because I'm not really terribly invested in that universe, but I did see Suicide Squad just because I heard it was really bad, and I wanted to experience it for myself, and I feel like it's probably... It has to be at least a little bit better, because I can't really imagine a movie being as bad as Suicide Squad was, but...
Yeah, I mean, Suicide Squad was a prime example of...
Marvel is doing this, so let's play catch-up. Yeah.
I think it's also I had a conversation last night about this, that it's a prime example of bad representation. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, that movie... Just to touch on it a little bit, that movie went with some racial stereotypes, quite a lot of racial stereotypes, and I remember when the movie had come out, there was a lot of back and forth about the sexualization of Harley Quinn, and I didn't have a problem with it because it's part of her character.
Right.
And it wasn't a big deal to me back then. And I mean, I saw the movie in theaters, and at the moment, I loved it. And I mean, when was that, 2016? I was like maybe
Something
like
like
17,
that, yeah.
18 years old then. I'd loved it, and then I'd realized there's nothing to love about it. But looking back now and having that comparison of the Suicide Squad costume and the Birds of Prey costume, now I'm seeing the big difference and why people had an issue with it back then.
Right.
Because it was definitely created for the male gaze, and that's something that many movies utilize, is that male gaze.
And it's one of those things that I'm glad we're having this discussion, because without people sharing stuff like that, it's something that I don't even think about, really. Because we're all, regardless of who you are, we're all kind of inherently locked into our own perspective, and I think it doesn't really help your experience if you're always constantly digesting art or anything creative through that same lens. I think it adds so much more to the experience when you can step back and think, how would this demographic think about it? How much would this person like the same thing, or would they even like it at all? So it's definitely very helpful to have that.
It definitely is, and I mean, you're right. Reading those articles and everything, I mean, I want to say maybe I posted that about a week ago, and in a week's time, I kind of ended up changing my mind in a way, because I was open to reading those other opinions and understanding it a little bit better.
Right. One thing that you had said just a second ago that I kind of wanted to go back to, another point that I thought was interesting in that, like, it's almost like the flip side of saying that everything is good and you shouldn't criticize it because it has this aspect going for it. One thing that kind of confused me, this has happened a couple times that I've seen, is that there'll be like one or two movies that's like, yes, this is the model of representation that we're going for, and like one of the big ones I think of is the 2016 Ghostbusters, where they did the all-female remake, and everyone was like, this is so great, women are being represented and it's awesome. But the one thing that really confused me is when I saw the trailer, and like you said, the racial stereotypes and the different stereotypes prevalent in Suicide Squad, I kind of got like the same sort of vibe from, like, it just didn't look, from like inherently it just didn't look like a very well written movie. It didn't look that funny, and people, like, whatever, maybe it's just me and my tastes in comedy are differing from what that movie is trying to go for. But one thing that I had a conversation with somebody about it at some point, and they were like, well, it's good because regardless of whether the movie is good or not, it's good because now this new generation of kids growing up with Ghostbusters will be able to see, like, oh man, Leslie Jones, I'm a little black girl, and there's an older black woman who's in this, like, cool position. Well, and then I was like, well, but how is that, like, that little kid is seeing Leslie Jones slapping Melissa McCarthy around, going, hell no, demon, get out, and I was like, that, like, how do you look at that and say that that is what you want to aspire to? And kind of going off of that, I was thinking of the other day, there was a movie that came out a few years ago I really liked called Widows. It was directed by Steve McQueen, but it was a mostly female leading cast, and nobody talked about that. And I thought that was very interesting because it had a lot of really great performances. Viola Davis, Cynthia Erivo, Michelle Rodriguez. There was one other woman, I forget her name, but the point being, there was a big leading cast of women, and it was without spoiling too much about that movie, if you haven't seen it, it's a big message of that movie is we're women and we don't need men to get shit done. We're on our own here. We're gonna prove that we're just as capable as these men. But yet nobody talked about that, and that could just be like the fact that, like, the way that it was distributed. But I kind of think it's almost a shame that because the IP of Ghostbusters is so popular, people are like, oh man, like, yes, that's what we want. But then they ignore something that is as legitimately good or even better made. Do you find that at all? In that there's kind of like this blind, like, yeah, that's good, that's what we want, and then there's kind of like almost this, not like ignorance, but like there's almost like ignoring, like latching onto sort of one idea but ignoring other ideas.
Yeah.
That was really rambling.
No,
I'm sorry.
no. I totally know what you mean, and that whole, like, that explanation was, to me, a perfect explanation of what is the difference between pandering and real representation.
Right.
Because that's,
Thank you for summarizing that in a coherent way. That was terrible what I just said.
I mean, I haven't seen either of those movies. Of course, I know about the Ghostbusters movie. I feel like I might have, the way you explained it, I may have heard of Widows before,
Mm-hmm.
but no, that's always been a really important topic to me, is, you know, trying to figure out, like, how do you figure out what the difference between what's that fine line between pandering and real representation? Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm trying to think of a movie. There's plenty of movies that are all just, they feel, when you're watching them, they feel like they're trying to pander to an audience that they don't know anything about.
Right.
And maybe the Ghostbusters movie is like that. Maybe it's not. Again, I have not seen that one.
Neither have I. So, again, it could just be an issue of it's not my brand of comedy, so I wouldn't like it. But it just seemed like you said, it just seemed like a very heavy instance of, like, we're jumping on this bandwagon and we know that this is the topic, this is the idea that's going to sell tickets at the time. So that's just how it seemed to me. I don't know.
No, I really wish that I could think of an example of a movie that panders, in my opinion. I've had this conversation so many times, but there's such a fine line just between watching a movie and feeling represented, whether it be from gender to sexuality, whatever it may be. There's just something so kind of interesting watching a movie that you feel like is pandering to your demographic, and just knowing that they don't have any idea what that demographic even is, really.
Mm-hmm.
I've definitely seen, there's definitely plenty of movies that have accurate respective representation, but there's also plenty of movies that it just feels like a cash grab, essentially, that they just want to capitalize off of a demographic that's trying to have their voices heard.
Right. I guess what I was trying to say is, like, do you find that pandering movie is better, is more, like, I guess not focused on, but like the movies that are pandering are almost more well known than the movies that are trying to be genuine? Or do you think that's kind of a I don't know, like a not true statement. I'm so bad at hosting a podcast.
That's definitely also an interesting one. I mean, in the explanation you just gave, I mean, yeah, that's a situation where the one that could feel like it's more of a pandering situation is definitely more well known. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure that I have heard of Widows. And I think that it can also go hand in hand with the whole, there's a lot of female character, like, archetypes that are in a lot of movies, and even in the ones that sometimes will say that they're representing women, end up just being the same old archetypes that are in every single movie.
Right.
But I don't know. That's a tough one. I kind of want to say yes, but at the same time, I'm not 100% sure. Like, I think that the movies that pander to their audiences they're the kinds of movies that just, I mean, I guess you're right. They're the ones that sell a lot of the time, because of the fact that the people who are writing them know how to write for their audience, and they'll write it as a character that they think people are going to think is cool.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a character that's a little less cool, air quotes, ends up being the most realistic representation of a woman. And having a movie that has that cool character with all of the cool effects and the cool storyline compared to a real woman and how she would handle something, I'm going to say when it comes down to it, yeah, I would say that the pandering movie probably does get more recognition.
Mm-hmm. And it's strange, too, because, like, the one, what I just thought of now is that, like, you can always kind of tell, because in the pandering movie, like, that's always apparent, like, in the marketing and in the, like, in the movie, but like when they're trying to sell it to you, it's always like in the Ghostbusters scenario, it's like it's Ghostbusters, but here are these funny women this time instead of the funny men. But it's almost like I think almost the best instances is when it's an afterthought of the representation. Like, have you seen the movie Annihilation?
I have not.
Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
That's like almost exclusively all females in that movie, except for Oscar Isaac. I think he's like the only male figure. But it took me I watched that movie twice before I even thought about that. So it's like I don't know. I think it's one of those scenarios where it's just like the vocal minority gets the most attention, and that just kind of it divides more, because you'll have those people that are like, oh, women aren't funny, women can't be good in movies, and you have the one group that's like, no, all women power, and like they're touting something that's not good, and they're holding up this image that is just completely false in their heads. But then somewhere in the middle is you have those movies like Annihilation or Widows that go unappreciated. I guess it's like it's just lost in the noise, instead of like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's just
almost like it gets lost in translation.
Yeah. I again, you're doing a great job of summarizing every incoherent point I'm trying to make. But yeah, so I don't know. I just it's a we could go on forever, I feel like, but it's a very important topic to talk about, and I think it's great that it is being talked about as much as it is.
Definitely.
And for everything I've said about how I think the mainstream movies are kind of the ones that pander, I think that it is great because we're definitely seeing an emergence of movies that don't at least from my perspective, my limited perspective, movies that don't pander and seem very genuine. And there's a lot of I mean, we wouldn't know from this year's Oscars, but there's a lot of women directors working today who are pushing that idea and demonstrating, I think more importantly for the future generations, that like, hey, you can do whatever you want to do. You don't have to have like you said, you don't have to have this worry of being blacklisted just because you're opinionated and you happen to have a different gender. It's great.
It's definitely, when it comes down to it, in my experience, the women that work in the film industry, whether they're directors or they're a gaffer or they work in audio, is a lot of them do just want representation of women that just want what they want, not these movies that, you know, the woman is sacrificing everything so someone else can be happy. Mm-hmm. Or these movies where everything was taken from them so they have to get revenge kind of thing, where it's always they're always put in a sad position, always. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there are movies like that, you know, like Kill Bill, where she's in a powerful position and people respect her.
Right.
Her character, and I mean her as well, but mm-hmm. When it comes down to it, me myself as an assistant director and a producer, I just don't want these movies where it's the same thing every time, because mm-hmm. that's what it is we're always put into these archetypes, whether it's a character in a movie or it's on set, like I said, of, you know, I'm considered bossy and rude because I'm in a position of power.
Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of comes back to the whole limited perspective, is that, like, a lot of times when you have a movie being made by someone who is not of that perspective that they're trying to talk about, like whether that be gender or race or ability versus disability, whatever, it always comes across as one note, because I think that's kind of just how we inherently see things, and the people who have that perspective don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And I think one of the good things about this movement is that it's saying, hey, there's not what you're thinking isn't really wrong, but there's more ways to think about it than
it's
the
not
than
so
the
black
way
and
we've
white, yeah.
right, yeah.
It's a topic that has a lot of dimension to it.
Mm.
And we're in a time period now where people are starting to look at it as such and not something that's just flat and that's it.